everyone for your patience, for allowing us to stream into the biased already, which is why we're starting a little bit late. But thank you all for your patience as we stream live today for the second edition of Converse with a Coach. For some of you who have joined us for the very first time today, my name is Mireille Karera, and I'm the CEO of Karera Coaching Group, and a coach, a trainer of coaches, a mentor, and above it all, I am just a dreamer, just like most of us. It's a pleasure to host you. Before I share a little bit more about our guests and about our topic today, allow me to share with you why Converse with a Coach exists. Converse with a Coach was created a few months ago, just when the whole world was going through the turmoil. And I was thinking, what should we do? How can we bring a little bit of a ray of hope in the world through topical discussions and platforms that provide hope and a little bit of encouragement to all of us during this season? And that's how this came about. My hope for you joining us live today, and those of you that are going to join us later on in rebroadcasting, is that you would be inspired, that you will sit back, relax, and truly learn from my guest speaker, but also learn from what we are going to share. Now, what you can expect for the next couple of minutes with myself and Dr. Terry Jackson is that you would be inspired, you will be touched, you would also learn a lot about a topic that is somewhat controversial, but at the same time very timely, considering where things are at in this world. Before I get into the topic, let me now introduce to you our guests. I mentioned his name a moment ago. His name is Dr. Terry Jackson. Dr. Terry Jackson is African American, and he is based in North Carolina. He is a TEDx speaker, a business advisor. He is an executive and leadership coach, and one of Marshall Goldsmith 100 and a Thinkers 50 awardee. And Dr. Terry Jackson and I met last year because we are part of the same network of executive coaches that help African leaders, African CEOs in becoming better leaders. So both of us are part of Breakfast Club Africa, which helps leaders to truly become better at what they do. So, Terry, did I introduce you well?
Yes, I'm wondering who that individual you were describing actually is.
Terry, it's a joy to have you join this conversation.
Thank you so much. I'm honored and I am humbled to be a part of this conversation today and be a guest on your show.
You know, Terry, when I was thinking about hosting an episode on conscious and unconscious biases, I couldn't think of a better person to talk to this topic than yourself. And do you know why? I believe that our audience will truly be in it for a treat because the world was once again shaken a few months ago when we witnessed what was happening to George Floyd as videos circulated around the world about an African American being killed right in front of the screens. So when I was thinking about an episode to talk about biases, and we will go into that in a moment, I just thought that bringing in the element of what everybody else has seen will be beneficial for this conversation with you and the audience. So I really am grateful that you are willing to not only talk to the topic, but also share your personal journey with us in terms of facing biases, racial biases in America, but also share with the audience as someone who has a PhD in leadership, what you have learned from your own personal journey, but also bringing in the academic research and studies that you have undertaken, going from that. So rather than me talking a lot, can I ask you to share with us your personal journey and more importantly, your experience in facing racial biases in America?
Well, thank you. Thank you for asking me to share, and I'm honored to share my story. I grew up here in North Carolina, grew up in a city during the time, or in the South during the time of segregation, meaning that African Americans here were segregated from whites. We couldn't use the same restrooms. We couldn't drink from the same water fountains. Everything basically was segregated. And, I was born in that environment. Somewhere around my first grade, well, actually third grade is where we went into what we call desegregation, where we began to go to school together. So I remember the night, 1968, when Dr. King was assassinated. I was sitting on my grandmother's lap, and I remember her words as Dr. King, they announced it on the news that Dr. King had been assassinated. My grandmother said, "Let him die." And so, yes. And so that kind of gave me a lot of foundation around who I am, being able to see that experience on the national news of the assassination of Dr. King, and then going to first and the second grade being segregated schools. And so I had an interest in sports, and my interest in sports, I was one of two African Americans on a American football team when I was probably 10 years old. And so, as an athlete, you're treated differently, right? You're not treated as an African American. They happen to see you different. And so that competition led me to not only want to compete on the field and on the court, but it also made me want to compete in the classroom. So as I matriculated through school, became a pretty good athlete and a pretty good student at the same time. And I remember one of the first times that I faced this thing called bias or racism or prejudice. I was in the 12th grade. And I remember we were at the middle of the year and we were switching over classes for the next semester. And I'd signed up for my classes. And so as I walk into this class, I have my leather jacket on, which denotes that I'm an athlete and I'm pretty good, and I'm nice sized guy. And so as I begin to walk into the classroom, I'm stopped by the teacher who's standing at the door. The teacher was a Caucasian teacher. And she asked me if I was going to her classroom and if I had actually signed up for her class. And I said, "Yes, I signed up for your class." She says, "Are you sure that you signed up for my class?" I said, "Yes, I'm sure that I signed up for your class." She said, "No one signed you up for my class?" I said, "No, ma'am, nobody signed me up for your class." And the reason she was asking that question was because it was the highest level vocabulary course in the school. And so what she saw was a big African-American athlete with a leather jacket on, and she had her assumptions. She had her biases and her prejudices, and she didn't know me. So I knew at that time exactly what was happening. So what I decided to do from a strategic perspective was to say, I'm going to sit down in her class. I'm not going to say anything until the first exam. When I take the first exam, I'm going to ace the first exam, and then I'll begin to talk. So I took the first exam in the class. I made a 96, which is an A. And all of a sudden, she began to ask me where I was considering going to college, if I thought about going to her particular college to play American football. And I told her no. No, I'm not considering it. That was kind of my first kind of brush, if you will, with racism or prejudice or bias, whatever you choose to call it. But it is something that is very prevalent in the culture here. I've had other experiences as well. I remember my last stint in corporate America working for a large corporation.
Terry, before we go to the professional you, allow me to stay with the personal side of you. So what you just shared with us, and really by us, I'm connecting to our audience, which is not necessarily on the American continent, but on the rest side of the world, particularly in Africa and Rwanda, where we are broadcasting from. So your story really gives us a first-hand experience into a young man, young African American man, a Black man, like some of us, all of us in Africa, who has experienced prejudice, biases firsthand. So what I'm hearing you say is that you've consciously made a choice to not retaliate or become a victim, but you resolved in you to just show that you are a human being, a pupil like anybody else, who's entitled to go into that class, irrespective of his look, irrespective of the prejudice as to, you know, whether you are apt to that level of vocabulary. So I really love that resolve from your side while you were still young. As we continue, allow me to just ask the audience to share their comments, their questions as we continue, so that this can be an interactive talk with, my mic is going down, and my colleagues will come and assist me with that in a moment. Just, you know, for the audience to engage and share the options and opportunities, and also times where they face the very same issues. So now you can continue sharing with your experience. You grew up and you went into corporate America.
Yes, you know, having attended a university that is a historically Black university, college, where 95% of all of my classmates were, or my university was African American. Now you move into the corporate setting, right? You move into a corporate setting with everyone. And so in my last position in corporate America, I remember, and this is after having earned my PhD, I remember an interview process. And I was interviewing with a gentleman who was going to be a peer of mine. And in interviewing with him, we had what I consider to be a very good interview. And at the end of every interview, I would ask the question, now that you have a better understanding of who Terry Jackson is, his skills, his competencies, his capabilities, would you hire me if you were the hiring manager? His answer to me was no. He said, because I didn't have experience in that specific industry. Now, my undergraduate was marketing. I was going to work for marketing organization and communications. And so he wasn't the hiring manager, so I wasn't that concerned. At any rate, I was hired by that organization to run a division of the organization. And he was my peer, meaning the gentleman who said that he wouldn't hire me. I went into that position with a chip on my shoulder, if you will. And that chip was, whatever I do, whatever my region does, it will always outperform his region. Because at the end of the day, business is about results, it's about performance. And so it was interesting because in that position for 5 years, we never missed a number. My region never missed a number. And we outperformed his region every year. And it was interesting because around year 2 and year 3, he began to call me, ask me for recommendations and advice as to how to better lead and manage his region. And he asked me, so what are you doing so differently than the others? And I just gave him a very simplistic answer. And that was, I'm treating human beings as human beings should be treated.
I love that.
That's it. And so from from that point forward, I think in 2011, I was the best. We had the best region in the company. And it was interesting because everyone who worked for me, it was the first time that anyone in that organization, any Caucasian in that organization, had ever worked for an African-American leader in that company. So that made it very, very interesting. I knew that prior to going there, but it was the challenge, right? It was the challenges, because we all have our biases, if you will. But it was a challenge of going and saying, regardless of who they are and what they think of me because of the hue of my skin, I'm going to go there and I'm going to treat everybody basically the same. I'm going to lift up that division, and we're going to be one of the best in the organization. And that's exactly what happened. Treating human beings as human beings.
I love what you just said. There's a lot of amazing wisdom nuggets that you just shared with us that I would love to unpack for our audience. So you basically, there's a pattern I'm seeing there, Terry. And the pattern is that you have great resolve, and your resolve is to perform no matter what the bias is, no matter how people treat you. And I think that's already one of the key teaching moments for people listening, so that whatever that is within you is not stained by people's words that are around you, particularly negative words. So thank you for sharing that resolve and that drive that is innate in you, which has helped you to perform and outperform even the peers that have expressed those biases towards you. So one of the nuggets I heard is that you treat people like human beings, irrespective of the hue of their colors. I love that word, hue.
Yes. And, when you look back at the etymology or the origin of words, and we see the word human, Human.
Yes.
If you go a little bit deeper, it's UE-MAN that some have taken and combined it. See, when you take the E away, what happens is you remove what the pigmentation is that the creator gave the original man.
Right.
And so I don't want to get into, we all know who the original human beings were and what they look like given the region of the world in which they were originally placed by the creator. And we don't want to get into all of that, but it's about the hue of skin, because it has a biological function. And that biological function was to protect the skin from the sun, given the region of the world. And so that's what human actually originated from. And then they condensed it, they removed the E, but human. And so that gives it a little different spin. However, it's really about treating human beings how to be human. That's all it is. We have to reconnect with our humanity, if you will. And I think that if we can do that, that puts us in a much better place and we treat each other better.
Yeah, indeed, 100% agree. So back to the topic of this conversation, which is conscious and unconscious biases. So I know that this is a topic that is so personal and close to your heart, but it may be something completely new to some of the people watching. Could you explain to us what those technical words mean, conscious and unconscious biases? How would you define them?
Okay, well, let me start by defining the bias, just in case, we use the term often, but sometimes we use terms and don't really know the meaning. But a bias is a term that describes a tendency or a preference toward a particular perspective or ideology. It's generally seen to be, one-sided, a one-sided perspective. And, our personal biases cause us to have preconceived opinions about people, about things. And, such preconceived opinions can create all kinds of inaccurate judgments around people. So as we look at what we know as implicit bias or unconscious bias, these are the attitudes we have towards people, or stereotypes that we associate with people without our conscious knowledge. We don't know that we're doing that. That's what it is. It means we are being biased, but we are unaware that we are being biased. But those biases are developed within the environment in which we are raised, and the environment in which we travel. And so we gain these biases. We're not aware that we have these biases or how they play out in our day-to-day life as we make decisions.
Yeah. And some of them we are conditioned to think in a certain manner without knowing why we think in a certain manner. So we don't know why we perhaps are more inclined. I think one of the words is inclination, tendency,
Yes.
to define bias. So sometimes we don't know why we prefer a certain type of food or a certain type of color, because that's what we see, that's what is available to us on a daily basis. Our senses, I guess, can also play a role in some of our biases, which happen to be unconscious. Now, for the biases which are conscious, I think you gave us an example of your former colleague that made the conscious decision not to hire you, should he hire you. Would you agree that that was a conscious bias on his part?
Yes, that was a very conscious bias. And he was biased because as he deemed it, lack of experience within that particular industry. And so he was biased toward those who had experience within that industry. Yes.
That's very good. I'm already receiving some comments on YouTube, and I see Terry Earthwind Nichols saying, human beings is so easy to miss still this day. So that was quote unquote human beings. Each of us gets to change ourselves first, and others will follow our lead. I love that. Thank you, Terry Earthwind Nichols, for sharing that. So I'm encouraged those who would like to comment, ask questions, to indeed continue doing that. So back to our topic, and with America in mind, because America is worrying the rest of the world when it comes to the area of racial bias and biases in general. Could you give us a perspective as to, what's going on in America nowadays?
Earlier in the conversation, you kind of alluded to George Floyd and the situation that happened. But there have been many George Floyds in the United States. There have been quite a few people who said that I can't breathe. And I think it was kind of the perfect storm, if you will. You had COVID-19 running rampant across the globe. You had, which actually stopped the world. Then you had the George Floyd situation, and the world being as slow as it was, it gave us the opportunity to pay attention to and focus on exactly what was happening. And that was, this police officer had his knee on George Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. And we had the chance to see the murder of an African-American male in real time. So that has created all of this social unrest as it relates to all of the protests that are happening. It's brought to mind again the whole subject of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the lack thereof. And let me make this point. Lack of diversity, equity, inclusion throughout the world and throughout organizations truly is the lack of leadership. The lack of leaders being able to look at the puzzle and make all pieces of the puzzle fit, knowing that at the end of the day, it's about performance and result, regardless of the hue of one's skin. Because that is the only differentiator. Gender, of course,
Mm.
It's the lack of vision from leaders, because this has been going on for a long time. I've referenced Dr. Martin Luther King early on. If you look back into the 60s, Dr. King, quote unquote, the man of peace, died violent death because he was shot. He was abused by police officers. He was brutally abused by police officers, Caucasians in the US, as he took his journey, and that the journey of civil rights, not only for this country, but for around the world. The world is getting a chance to see what America actually is as it relates to inability to include, create equity, and be a diverse society.
And I agree with you that lack of diversity is a leadership issue. It's a leadership challenge that leaders have not been able to truly address, for generations. So I do not expect you and I on this conversation to solve that problem. A disclaimer for those that may be watching, but I believe that what we are going to say will be a drop contributing towards something that will be more of an inclusive world. Now, clearly biases are way more than just racial biases, not just, looking at the color of your skin, black, white, yellow, green, blue, all types of colors. I think biases can be as subtle as gender, not including women to certain leadership circles, or people of certain cultures. In Africa, it could be tribalism. People of this tribe do not mix with those tribes. You don't give opportunities for people looking like this, coming from this social circle. I'm thinking of India with the caste system. So human beings have this unfortunate tendencies of, and tendency is one of the definitions of biases, of excluding people who look different, who have different experiences, but do not see the value they add to the table. I would like us to go now, as we shift gears, towards how to create a more inclusive society and inclusive space in the workspace. I know you've researched a lot, you have written a lot of articles on that topic. Can you share with the audience a little bit more on what you call equality and equity? Over to you.
Yes, thank you so much. One of the articles that I wrote on diversity and inclusion, and how organizations as well as society can become more diverse and inclusive on purpose. I was doing a little bit of research, and I came across something in the world of physics and how it related to inclusion. And I found that there's a word called fusion. And fusion in and of itself means that the elements in physics come together, or that you bring together on purpose in such a way that they are all inclusive of everything. And I'm thinking to myself, if we can do that in the world of physics, why can't we do that in society as a whole? Because it's taking a human being to bring those particular elements together. And, fusion is the process of, or a result of, joining two or more things together on purpose. So the differentiator is purpose. And so as organizations begin to look at becoming more diverse and inclusive of women, of other ethnicities, we need to do it with purpose in mind, understanding how it helps to improve business results. Because at the end of the day, it comes down to the results that the business drive. You can drive desired result through an inclusive organization or inclusive society. So fusion is a word that I love. And to give you a little bit more history on this word fusion, in my hometown of Wilmington, North Carolina, in 1898, there was a coup where whites in this area built weapons, killed off African Americans. At the time in 1898, my hometown was the most literate. It was the most literate city in the South. African Americans numbered about 11,000 and Caucasians numbered about 8,000. Wow. So the African Americans were the attorneys, the doctors, the business people, you know, the barbers, all of that. There was a jealousy that existed there. So in the November, I think it was November 11th election of 1898, they told all of the blacks to stay home and not vote. And that was because blacks were merging with this party. The blacks were merging with the Republican Party and winning elections, political elections in 1898. That party was called the Fusion Party. So that party of blacks and Republicans fusing together on purpose to win elections was very successful. Democrats at that time decided to build weapons, kill a bunch of people, take their land, and that has been the quote unquote black cloud over the city of Wilmington since 1898.
Right. So there's a lot of things that I guess one can unpack from that story. What I'm thinking, as I hear you talk about the values and benefits of an inclusive society, and I've been part of so many of those, whether, you know, it was back in the days when I was part of a, you know, global corporate, or when we go and coach organizations in different parts of Africa. The topic of diversity is certainly there. Inclusion, probably not so much so, but I'm thinking to myself, if leaders know that inclusion has financial benefits and benefits on performance, why aren't we doing that? Or why aren't we seeing more of an inclusive leadership team? There are some studies that Forbes has done about women on boards, how more, you know, inclusive and diverse boards with women and men are actually outperforming those who are, you know, sort of non-diverse. So my question to you, Terry, as someone who studied this for a while, and I know you train a lot on that, why is it so difficult to get to that?
That's a very, very good question. Why is it difficult to get to diversity and inclusion? Yeah. When the numbers clearly show it's beneficial to organizations because of the results that they drive. And I'd like to say that, you know, part of the challenge is when you become more diverse and inclusive, this is some of the thought process. It means that you have to give up something. Mm. And oftentimes what we're talking about is the giving up of power, right? By including people. And when we look at corporations in America, you know, there are probably only 4 African Americans who are CEOs. And so as we look at the boards and we look up at the leadership makeup, what we're seeing is a great deal of Caucasian men. So they hear diversity, they hear inclusion, even that of women, and they see there's a fear of relinquishing of power in their in the C-suite or on the board of organizations or leadership positions within. And so that fear prevents it, even though the empirical evidence indicates that organizations who are more inclusive are better performers. Now, Professor Scott Page at the University of Michigan wrote a book years ago called The Difference. And that book clearly laid out the business case for diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Mm-hmm.
What we're finding is organizations are having a difficult time becoming inclusive. I think that's intentional because, again, it's about power. It's about a power structure that has to be eliminated. And I now speak more about inclusion than I do diversity, because that's the real issue. You'll hire me into an organization. However, you include me, then that means that I'm going to find my way on a career track that I can ascend up the ladder, given what my skills, my competencies, and what my capacity to learn will be. When you just bring me into the organization and you just count the numbers or check the box, well, we have this ethnicity, we have this group of people, we are diverse. Inclusion is the real challenge. Inclusion is the challenge, whether it's a tribe, whether it's tribalism, or whether it's ethnicity, whether it's gender. It's always about inclusion, not necessarily diversity.
I agree. And diversity is the most obvious one, right?
Yes.
So you see when people are different, sometimes it's by the skin, sometimes it's by the way we speak. So the differences are the most obvious one. And to your point, diversity is not the issue, but the real challenge, really, the real meat here is how do we create a more inclusive society or businesses? I like what you said about power. And how it is connected to fear. When I've been thinking about it, for me, the main issue that I've observed was the fear of the unknown, not knowing, what else the other person, what else the other group might do. So fear of the unknown is probably what is creating biases, and very much so when it comes to racism. And I'm sure there are many other sources of fears that are connected to prejudices and biases in different forms. Now, let's shift from diversity for a moment and now talk about inclusion. If you were to sort of do the how-to at this stage, and then we will get to the audience. We still have a few minutes to receive some questions and comments. But as we do that, can you perhaps give us a few quick tips on, what you believe that leaders or people in general in, life, because I know there are some students watching us, there are some graduates, but also those who are not just yet in the positions of leadership that are watching us. So if there were some quick steps of the to-dos or how-to-dos, what would you say that people should do in order to create a more inclusive organization or society?
Yes, and before I give those couple of steps, I'm going to say this about inclusion. Inclusion means that you make something or someone a part of the organization, right? Inclusion is making the mix of the ingredients work as a whole. Inclusion is the melting pot, as we like to call America, the great melting pot, which it is not. It's the melt in the melting pot. Inclusion is the disrupting wave, brings all things together. That wave always includes everything in the mix. So be more inclusive. First and foremost, what we have to do is we have to sit at the table with everyone, men, women, regardless of ethnicity, we have to sit at the table with the educated and the uneducated, right? We have to sit at the table with people from different tribes, people from different hues, different walks of life. There's a value to every perspective that everybody brings at the table. And what inclusion is saying is we're going to take those values, and we're going to have 10 people at the table with 10 different perspectives, and we're going to make one perspective, which is one perspective is going to be greater than those 10 individual perspectives, because now you have everybody in the mix contributing to the organization or to society. So you must be inclusive. We are going in an inclusive direction as a society. You got to sit at the table with everyone, right? Mm-hmm. You have to be mindful and continuously work on rooting what your biases are, the impact that your biases can have on others.
But you have to be conscious of those, right? So yes. As you come to the table, as you sit at the table, as you have more people representative of the society, you need to be aware of your own personal biases, right? Yes. So, and that I imagine comes with self-examination. In coaching, we call it introspection, we yes. call it, knowing yourself, etc. So those are the few things I'm picking up. What else do we need to do?
Yeah, so knowledge of self is awesome. You have to have that, and you have to have faith in humanity.
So meaning that you value the other person that is around the table with you.
I value that other person that's around me. I strip them down in such a way that I'm not looking at the hue of their skin. I'm not looking at the gender, because we're all going to have the same experience. What I'm looking at is intelligence, the knowledge, and their experience that they bring to the table. And I want to be able to see them as another human being, whether it's the CEO of the organization or someone who works at a lower level within the organization. At the end of the day, when you see them as human, you see them as equal. So yeah. there's equity. And if I see you same way that I see myself, we can communicate better, and we can resolve more challenges than we can as if I put a label on you as CEO and I'm the janitor, or put a label on you that you are an attorney and I'm just a school teacher. So removing of the labels oftentimes should bring about equity as it relates to me seeing another human being as a human being versus position that they hold, because the position that they hold paints a certain picture to me, right? We automatically begin to create a superior-inferior relationship when we look at when we start looking at titles, when we're all just human.
I agree. And that's one of the biggest biases in leadership, where people tend to attribute the term leadership to position rather than influence or what you add as value to this world. The janitor, to use your example, certainly bring value to an organization. Quick example, because I know that we're running out of time in a moment. I remember that there was a time when our cleaner in the office, in this office, had lost her mother and she could not come to the office. And we realized that, in fact, she was very, very important, because there are a number of things that we saw her do and we took for granted while she was there. But when she was absent for a few days, that position became very important, because we could not do without her, having teas and coffees, serve the guests, etc. It's just, a quick example, just to show how valuable people are in their respective roles, even though they don't carry the title of, doctor, CEO, etc. So thank you for sharing that. But I won't let you go without you sharing with the audience about equality and equity.
Yes, and equality and equity are different. And so with that, we must understand that, equity involves understanding people's needs and giving them what they need. Equality aims to ensure that everyone gets the same thing. With equity, say for instance, we're standing at a fence, I'm trying to look over the fence. I'm 5'2", the other person is 6 foot tall. Well, if I give one box to each person, what happens is that person still sees a little bit higher and a little bit further than I see, because we've been given one box. Now, if I want to bring about equity, then I need to have enough boxes that I'm standing on that equals the same height of that individual either on one box or if they're standing on the ground. And so for those who, I can give another example, and I know that we're running out of time, but I can talk about healthcare, right, as it relates to equity. And when we talk about healthcare, around equity, we have to be able to give people what they need. And different people have different health challenges. So we need to meet the needs of each health system needs to meet the needs of the people based upon what their challenges are. So we need to give them what they need. Everybody may not need, like in the US, it's not about diabetes, all the time. It's not about hypertension all the time. So you can't treat everybody the same. It's about, if you're in a particular area and this particular population has certain challenges, we need to be able to fulfill those challenges given what their needs are, right? We don't just need to, one size doesn't fit all, if you understand what I'm saying when it comes to healthcare, right? You need to be more specific. I'm sure in some certain, in the continent of Africa, there are certain areas that have different types of health issues. And so we can't go there with one size fits all and saying, here's what we're going to do. We need to be more specific, right? It has to be equitable, right? Meaning everyone has to have what they need and have to be treated the same.
I agree, 100% agreed. And it's there's so much that we can share, and we started a little bit late because of technical issues, and I wish we had more time for us to unpack a number of things. And one of the things I wanted us to talk about today was the relationship between African Americans in America and Africans on the African continent. I don't know whether the audience will indulge me. I think the audience will indulge me in asking you that one question. And before I ask the question, I will, circle back to what I said at the beginning of this conversation, because you and I are part of the same network of executive coaches helping African leaders, particularly those who are at the head of the organization. But let me ask you a question. What made you wanting to be part of a solution in Africa, being an American? Could you talk?
That's an excellent question. I was fortunate in that growing up, started reading about African history at a very early age. And as you begin to read African history, and then you kind of compare and contrast to US history, you're like, okay, this is quite interesting. So you begin to find out some truths, right? And you begin to read about, I think it was a scientist named Leakey, who indicated that the original woman originated in Africa. So you begin to do a little bit of research. And so I did my DNA to kind of understand exactly where my ancestors would have originated. And at the time, of course, after Geneva Convention, when it broke up Africa, it would be Cameroon. Cameroon would be where my ancestors originated. And a lot of people think Ghana based upon my physical features. Cameroon. So with that, I know with Africa, Mother Africa, being the continent where all humanity originate from, most important relationship does not exist today. It should exist today, but is growing. The relationship between the African American and the African. There has to be a reconnection for lots of reasons. From an educational perspective, we're well educated. From a resource perspective, Africa is the mother of all resources. We here kind of lack in resources and power. We know that Africa feeds the world. Yeah. We know that the challenge with Africa is not Africa itself, it's with those who go in and exploit Africa. And so what we need to be able to do as African Americans is help Africa return to its greatness of being a world leader by connecting the well-educated African Americans with the Africans there to understand what is going on in the exploitation of what is happening in Africa. When I look at the types of contracts for petroleum companies that go there and find oil and money that they give to the government, it's pennies on a dollar compared to what those companies are making. So until we understand that we are one, you're my cousins, you're my long lost brothers, you're my long lost sisters, until we can make that, which is the most powerful connection that can potentially happen, and people know this. That was my rationale behind wanting to be able to help leaders in Africa understand the true power that they have. And if you have all the resources, you can build these multi-billion-dollar, trillion-dollar organizations to employ your people, make Africa what it should be. And that's my passion behind all of that.
And I'm very grateful for your passion. If it wasn't for your passion, we wouldn't have connected last year, and you know, the audience wouldn't have benefited from your talk and really gleaned from your wisdom. So allow me to truly thank you for who you are, Terry, Dr. Terry Jackson. You are someone that I believe, and I hope that the audience has learned from today and has learned from your story of being resolved, your story of truly being seen and coming out as a human being, not someone who is perceived to be from one specific group or another. And that's something that I hope that people will walk away from this conversation with. And before I share my concluding remarks, let the audience know how they can connect with you. So Terry, those who are interested in getting to know more about your work, more about the research that you have published, how can they connect to you?
Well, thank you. I am out on LinkedIn under, yes, Terrence D. Jackson, PhD. You can find me on LinkedIn. I also play a lot on Facebook. You can find me on Facebook. I'm on Twitter as Dr. Terry Jackson, PhD. As you mentioned, and as I mentioned on LinkedIn, you talked about published works. I have roughly 150 to 65 articles out on LinkedIn around business and how to improve business and different steps around that. I have a book titled Transformational Thinking, the first step toward individual and organizational greatness, because it begins with self. That's pretty much it.
TEDx as well. I was saying to you earlier on that I truly enjoyed your talks on TEDx. It's not just one, but at least 2 talks that I watched on TEDx, which talk about transformation, but at the same time, more about your personal journey as to how you transformed and turned your life around.
Yes.
Thank you for sharing that. And as we conclude, there are 2 things I would like to share. The first one is that next Sunday, we will be joined by Jane Thomas, who is based in Vancouver, Canada. Jane Thomas is a counselor and a coach who is originally from India. And the topic for next week's episode will be on dealing with unresolved issues, dealing with those emotions that have been with us for many, many, many years and decades, and gleaning from her experience as a young woman growing up in India and now being a counselor and a coach. She's going to talk to us about how you can heal your heart, your emotions, and become a leveled and a whole person. So I'm inviting those watching to tune in next week on Sunday at 6 p.m. Kigali time or 4 p.m. Universal time. So that was my one thing. The very last thing I will say before we say goodbye is this. Yesterday, I received I guess, heartwarming and worrying message from a young man on Facebook who, was very pleased with the work that I do and that my team does in Rwanda. But the young man just finished high school and is going to university. So as he was complimenting our work, he said that he didn't feel that he was fit and he was apt to be relevant today. And I thought that was somehow something that didn't resonate with me, because he felt that because he is young, he cannot add value to people and organizations. So I'm closing with this particular story just to let you know that when we are not addressing biases, conscious or unconscious biases, the flip side of what Terry was saying to us, the reverse of the coin, is that it can get to us. It can get to us to think that we are less than, we are not good enough, and that in a way goes down, it becomes a downward spiral where we are not seeing ourselves as human beings that can add value to organizations, to societies, and to the world. So as we complete this show today, my request and invitation to you is that you see yourself as someone who can add value, irrespective of what the rest of the world is saying. Be like Terry today, who was resolved to truly make it, not only in high school when he faced prejudice, but in corporate America where his region outperformed other regions. But not only that, Terry was humble, but he is someone who has achieved incredible academic excellence. And to use some of the terms that I hear that are quite apt to describe him, is that he achieved Black excellence in academia. So, audience, whether you're African, African American, or someone in a different continent, know that you have amazing gifts to bring to this world. That is my concluding remark. I hope that you will tune in next week on Sunday. Until then, I'm inviting you to subscribe to this channel so that you can get to receive more alerts. And if you need to continue a conversation with a coach like myself, my team, and people like Terry, do send us a note. You will have details on my YouTube channel and also on my personal website, mireillekarera.com, or our company website, cora-coaching.com. Until then, I very look forward to seeing all of you next week and hearing your comments. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Terry. See you all soon. Bye-bye.